Welcome to the second lecture on international trade. In this particular lecture, we will cover international trade from a theoretical standpoint, using supply and demand functions and contributing to the excess supply and excess demand functions to look at policy. In the earlier lecture, we looked at general equilibrium trade models based on comparative advantage. In this case, we're going to look at partial equilibrium trade models, in particular the spatial price equilibrium trade model, or what we call the law of one price. Spatial price equilibrium models assume that prices equilibrate across regions, and that the only difference between prices is due to shipping and handling and other transaction costs. Some of these will include tariffs and others will include non-tariff barriers. What we do is we construct excess supply and excess demand functions, and these are the key concepts in determining the price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium in these so-called SPE or spatial price equilibrium models. So if we consider the case of no trade, or what we call autarky, we see that domestic prices are determined by the intersection of supply, the supply function, and the demand function. Trade occurs if the price of wheat, say, in another region exceeds the domestic price P star by an amount greater than the transportation cost. For any price above P star, and P star, remember, is the equilibrium price in perfect competition or in autarky, and for any price above P star, the region is willing to export to other regions, and that export amount is given by the excess supply function, the amount it's willing to trade after satisfying domestic demand. So you notice here at P star, it's willing not to trade anything because it's all taken up by domestic consumers. Assuming that we have no transaction costs or tariffs or anything like that, then what it follows is this red line, where this red line is simply the difference between what is demanded at that price and what is supplied at that price. So for example, if we have a price that's at P1, we would supply amount B, but we would only consume amount A. So then this distance from the vertical line to C is the excess supply. Of course, if the price of wheat in other regions lies below P star by the amount of the transaction cost, trade will also occur. But in this case, the region becomes a net importer of wheat. The demand by this region for imports is given by the excess demand function, which is the demand left over after buyers purchase all that domestic producers will supply at that price. It is determined as shown. So here we've got that excess supply curve, while the excess demand curve works the same way. So if P2 is lower than this price that clears the domestic market under autarky, then what will happen is the amount that people will demand is given by that distance P2 to Z. The amount that domestic suppliers will provide is given by P2X. So this distance XZ has to be satisfied by importing from other suppliers, and the amount XZ is equal to this distance P2Y. So that gives you the excess demand. Instead of the term transportation costs, I prefer to use the term shipping and handling costs. The excess supply and excess demand curves do not in practice intersect at P star, the autarkic price, because of these shipping and handling costs. The excess supply curve will shift up parallel by the unit of transaction or shipping and handling costs, or pivot if costs are ad valorem. By ad valorem, I mean as a percentage rather than a per unit. Likewise, the excess demand curve will shift downwards parallel by the shipping and handling costs, or pivot down if cost is ad valorem. So let's consider trade in wheat between Canada as the exporter and China as the importer, and let's assume that no other regions are involved. So we start with this diagram for Canada, where the autarkic price is given by the intersection of the supply for Canada, the C denotes Canada, and the demand is given by this. Now what happens is the price in Canada is PC, and wheat producers produce Q star. Just to settle things a little bit, B then is the quasi-rent or producer surplus that Canadian producers get, and A is the consumer surplus of Canadian consumers. Then in China we have a greater demand than they can supply, so alpha is the autarkic amount of consumer surplus, beta is the associated producer surplus, and the price in China would be PCH. Notice that there's a huge difference between the two prices, and we have not yet mapped out the international market. Now, given the international market, we see that we have an excess supply curve for Canada and an excess demand curve for Canada, and otherwise the diagram is similar to that of the previous slide. We can add to that the excess demand curve for China and then determine the intersection of the blue line, the excess demand for China, and the excess supply from Canada, the red line, to determine how much is traded, Q trade, and P trade. Now if we add in the shipping and handling, or what I've called here the transaction costs, then that shifts the excess supply curve upwards as indicated, and instead of the price being here, we shift that price up to this point here, and Q stays, also falls from here down to Q trade. So the Chinese and Canadian prices differ now by the shipping and the handling costs. So this is the price in Canada, this is the price in China. Now we can complete this by adding in some of this information and dragging these prices across. So this is the trade price for China, and we see in China that we've increased the amount that's purchased from Q star to QCH upper script D. And now what happened is consumers in China have increased their consumer surplus by these areas beta, phi, and delta, but producers in China have lost beta because they've reduced their production from Q star down to QCH superscript S. In Canada, the price is now given by this price Canada trade. Consumers in Canada lose B and C, but Canadian producers gain that B and C, and in addition they gain G as a surplus. So the Canadian surplus going to producers has increased. The surplus in China going to consumers has increased, but producers have reduced their surplus by a little bit, and on the Canadian side it was the consumers that lose. Now it's interesting to note that in the international market we can calculate the Canadian gain as equal to areas B and E. Remember, that's your supply curve, and it's kind of like a producer surplus, but includes any changes to consumers as well as producers. In China, and that gain is the same as G, so that area B plus E is equal to that triangle G. And in China, the gain is this phi plus delta, and that is equal to A. So this is the gain to the consumers in China. Now we can look at a particular case known as British Columbia's log export restrictions, and let's just look at that a minute. Forest companies in BC can only declare or only export logs from federal or private lands if logs are declared surplus to domestic requirements. Notice that they can export from federal or private lands, but not for BC public lands, not from BC public lands, which is the majority of land in the province. And they can only export logs if those logs are declared surplus to domestic requirements. That is, no domestic buyer is forthcoming or an offer to purchase surplus logs is deemed inadequate. In other words, there are people who would, or firms that would want to purchase the logs, but they don't give a price that's high enough. A Timber Export Advisory Committee, known as TEAC, advises on disparities between offers and bids. Historically, log exports rose when lumber markets were weak, but fell as demand picked up. Log exports from BC have become an important part of BC's external trade. In 1987, log exports were approximately 4 million cubic meters. A decade later, they were under 1/2 million cubic meters. Now, keeping that in perspective, in 1987, they were probably harvesting about 75 million cubic meters. Log exports rose dramatically since 1997. By 2005, they reached nearly 5 million cubic meters, falling to 3 million cubic meters by 2009 because of the global financial crises, and then rising rapidly to well over 5 million cubic meters in 2011. But by 2020, they were back to about 3 million cubic meters. In the meantime, the amount that we harvested fell somewhat to between 55 and 60 million cubic meters, or even less. I'm not sure of the number anymore. So we can look at this in terms of British Columbia and the international market, because British Columbia is a log exporter and it can have an influence on world price. So it's not just a price taker. So price and quantity under autarky are PA and QA. So this amount would be used in the province, and PA would be the price. So that determines this excess supply curve. And then we add to that excess supply curve a per unit shipping and handling cost, denoted T. All right, and then ES prime would be the excess supply curve of logs. The price would go up to the world price from the autarkic price, which I've denoted P of A for autarkic. At the world price, producers of logs, so in other words the timber companies or the landowners, gain A, B, and C. A and B are taken from domestic users of logs, so furniture companies, lumber makers, and that kind of stuff. So it's the consumers that lose while the producers gain. And this is an argument used to support free trade in logs because it enhances the value of land by this amount. All right, we're going to look at what happens when BC restricts log exports to QR, where QR is equal to this distance Q1. Recall that the autarkic price, no trade price, results in a price of PA and a quantity of QA. But because of trade, Canada would be able to have an excess supply curve of ES plus T, which is the shipping and handling cost, so ES prime. And now what we're going to do is we're going to shift the ES prime curve so that it is vertical at that point. So BC sells to the world market at a price of P1 up here, because we have to take that transport cost off. But the domestic price is P0. So compared to the case of no exports, consumers lose ABX, but producers gain ABXC, so the net gain is a plus C. In addition, R is a surplus area because you're selling this amount of logs in the international market, but at a price of P1, you basically earn this R, area R, because it's the price P1 multiplied by the amount of exports, Q1 minus Q0 or QR. Now, who captures this area? Well, that depends on who can capture it. It could be that it's wasted in through the log exporting process, but it could also be captured by the exporter of the logs, the company, or by the landowner, which in many cases is simply the government. Now let's compare it to the more realistic situation where we compare free trade to log export restrictions, but now we allow log exports to occur freely, and we assume that the world price is PW. All right, so before we put the restriction on, we assume that PW is the world price. Then the amount supplied would be given over here by QW. With a log export restriction, however, the BC consumer loses H plus S, this little area here, all right, because the log export restriction allows this amount of logs to be exported. That raises the price to PR international, but then you have to take away the shipping and handling cost. So then P1 becomes the relative price. Consumers lose H plus S, but producers gain H plus S plus I plus J, but they lose K as a producer surplus because they've gone from this price here, the world price, and they now produce less because of the restriction. So the restriction is equal to QS equal Q1, which is equal to R. The net gain to BC is thus I plus J minus K, with J a rent due to the export restriction. This can easily be measured if the elasticities of supply and demand in each of the markets are known. Now let's turn to the case of government intervention, which is more interesting. And let's assume there are no shipping and handling costs because it makes the diagram somewhat easier. So we're going to consider the impacts of 3 policy interventions that have identical price and quantity impacts. So we're going to adjust them. Whether it's an import duty, an export duty, or a quota, we're going to adjust the 3 in such a way that they end up with the same Q. And we're going to look at the welfare effects of the 3 policies. They should be identical except with respect to who collects the policy-created or policy-induced rent. Suppose that a country acts as a monopsonist in purchasing wheat from an exporter. In that case, the excess supply curve shifts from ES to ES prime, which is your marginal outlay function that we looked at before, leaving the excess demand of the importer where it is. Previously, the importer paid P star for an amount Q star, but now that it acts as a monopsony buyer, it'll follow the marginal outlay curve, the ES prime, and choose to equate ES prime against the excess demand function, in which case the price would go up to P1, and this would then be the optimal tariff quantity. So the monopsony essentially charges an import tax, a tariff rather. So with the tariff, the price to the importer goes to P1 and the price to the exporter is PX. What is lost is this D plus G, which is the global welfare loss. The consumers used to get A plus B plus C plus D, but now they only get A. But B and C goes to the whoever is able to collect that tariff, say the government of the importing country. The producers of the importing country are only, the price of that the producers receive, the country that is exporting, is down here. So that means that E and F and G is lost as a producer surplus or quasi-rent to the exporting country, but E and F is then captured as the tariff by the importer. The tariff then is equal to the difference between the price P1 and PX multiplied by the total amount that is now imported, and that gives this area, this rectangular area. So the importing consumers lose, producers gain. Net loss is B plus C plus D. Exporting consumers gain, producers lose. Net loss is E, F, G. So you can understand why some importers will go to their government and attempt to get this tax put in place, this tariff, because it's to their benefit. Now consider all three cases in one: a countervail duty, which was the import tax, or the import tariff rather, which shifts that ES line up to ES prime, versus an export tax by the exporting country, which would give us ED prime instead of ED, so the excess demand is affected, versus a quota, which is QT. Let's assume that all three end up giving us a quantity QT, recalling that Q star, P star, or pardon me, PC for Canada is the price in the international market, so it would be, say, the Chinese price plus the shipping and handling costs. Now, each of these duties, countervail duty, the export tax, or the quota, ends up giving us this rectangle, N plus M, this deadweight loss, WX, and the available producer and consumer surpluses. So again, the deadweight loss is W plus X. Chinese consumers lose M plus W. Canadian producers lose N plus X. The rent is given by this M plus N. This is the amount that is up for grabs, basically, that the Canadian government can get by imposing export tax, the Chinese government by imposing a tariff, an import tariff, Canadian producers by simply restricting output, or Chinese importers by restricting the amount they import. One can straightforwardly determine what the best action is. Suppose we have an international market where we have excess supply and excess demand, and now a producer, an exporter, is going to try and collect the rent. So the rent in that market is determined to be a maximum when the marginal revenue curve associated with this excess demand curve is intersecting the excess supply curve from above, and we see that the rent function then goes up and then comes down at Q star, where all the available monopoly rent is no longer captured. So it's not captured at zero. It rises as the restriction goes on as it's reduced rather, and then it falls as the restriction is reduced further. So this is the maximum, and notice that with linear demand and supply curves, that's 1/2 of Q star. Now we're going to tackle some more difficult items here. We're going to look at embodying trade effects in the analysis of domestic agricultural policies, but this could apply to any sector other than just only agriculture. Domestic policy often ignores the impacts on foreign producers. But in the case of when we're dealing with carbon and carbon offsets, for example, we need to take into account what happens in other countries. And to do so, we need to apply these kind of models. The excess demand or excess supply function of the rest of world producers or consumers of agricultural products, of efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, needs to be taken into account directly in domestic supply and demand models to analyze policy. So how do we include excess supply or excess demand in a single framework? What we're going to do is we're going to look at something which may look a bit difficult, a bit complex, but it's really not that bad. We begin with a back-to-back diagrammatic representation of the 3-panel diagram used for above trade modeling, and we're going to compress it into a single back-to-back diagram. So let's begin first this back-to-back diagram with the autarky situation. So this is where each country and we'll look at Canada and the rest of the world, and we're using durum wheat. And the reason we're using durum wheat is that Canada is a big player in durum wheat as one of the biggest exporters and certainly one of the big producers as well. So here we have a back-to-back diagram, and what's interesting is when we look at Canada, we measure things in this direction. So you got to get your head around to a supply curve that's upward sloping in this direction, and likewise the demand curve then for Canada has to be downward sloping in this direction. In the rest of the world, we have an upward sloping supply and a downward sloping demand, just as usual. In the rest of the world, and we're going to use the subscript R, the autarky, the no trade price and quantity, is given by the intersection of supply and demand at point M. In Canada, it's at point beta, and the price in Canada is well below that in the rest of the world, and the quantity is much lower than it is with trade. So now we come to the back-to-back diagram, and we got to construct, first of all, the excess supply curve for Canada. So here's the excess supply. Again, we take this distance, which I've marked with this double line here, to show that this is the same distance here. And then we shift that up by the amount of the shipping and handling costs, which we denote with the T. So now we have an excess supply and an excess supply here with the T. What we're going to do is we're going to add to that ES curve, we're going to add the rest of the supply that's supplied by the rest of the world. So we're going to add to the ES curve here the supply from the rest of the world. So up until this point here, excess supply doesn't matter. So we follow the domestic supply curve up to this point. And from that point, we're going to add the excess supply curve, this part, to this one. And when we do that, we get this ST curve. All right. The intersection of that, let's just ignore this for a minute, the tariff. The intersection of that occurs at point E. So the price at point E is the price in the rest of the world with trade. That's what the T means. So the price has dropped from this autarkic price, PR star, intersection M and QR star, to E being the intersection point. The price is down to N, and we drop this to the quantity in the rest of the world under trade. But we're missing some things here. So we're missing what's happening in the Canadian situation. So given the price here, we now reduce the price to Canada by the amount of the shipping and the handling cost. All right, that gives us a price in Canada of PC under trade, which means that the amount that Canada demands, notice you got to be careful here that these curves are in the positive direction. So with these back-to-back diagrams, we have positive in this direction, positive in this direction. So the demand in Canada is QCD, so it's lower, so consumers in Canada will consume less durum than they did previously, but the supply has increased from QC star to QCS, and we've gone from beta to gamma being what Canadian consumers consume, to alpha what Canadian suppliers supply. And it's this difference here that is then exported and accounting for this difference here. So what happens is ST equals the supply curve of the rest of the world plus the ES plus T curve. All right, so here we've got the ES plus T. We've gotten rid of the other one. Notice that this kink here occurs where that intersects the vertical axes. We slide up or down this curve and not up this one. So now we've gotten to this point N, where the price rest of the world is trade, just as in the previous diagram. the transaction cost or the shipping and handling cost shifts that down, and we end up with the Canadian price under trade, Canadian supply, Canadian domestic demand. This is the amount that would be supplied by the rest of the world. This is the amount that the rest of the world demands under this new circumstance, and we end up with alpha gamma is equal to NK, and that's equal to QCE. All right, so this 0 to QCE is the amount that is produced and produced outside of the rest of the world, is produced by Canada and is imported by the rest of the world. QRS, this amount here, is what's produced by the rest of the world, so this QRS is added to the QCE to come up with the QR big T. So if we consider wheat trade, trade occurs between Canada and the European Union, say. We ignore other players in the wheat trade by assumption. Consider the case where the EU first imposes an ad valorem import duty on Canadian wheat and then follows with an import quota. In all cases, the demand for wheat is a derived demand, sometimes I put a double D in that case, by the flour and the pasta producers. Now we're going to get into some very complicated diagrammatics. Let ES include the shipping and handling costs. That's one simplification, and you'll see that that's not going to be a very simple simplification. ST then is, as before, ST is simply the sum of this S in the European Union, and this ST adds to that, at that point, it adds the excess supply from Canada. So this is the supply curve that EU faces. Therefore, we get this result that the price in the EU is P0. Q0 is the amount that's then produced in that free trade kind of situation. Q0 is what's produced, this is what's demanded or consumed. This is what is produced in the Europe, and this is the amount consumed in Canada and the amount consumed produced in Canada. So if we go to the next slide, now things are going to get very complicated, and this is where I have to admit that even some of my colleagues have trouble with and these are PhDs in agricultural economics, so I wouldn't worry too much about seeing this kind of thing on an examination. But here's how it works. So we begin with this situation that we had in the previous diagrams, where now we're calling this P0, and we've got this intersection with the supply curve T, big T, that is the supply that we see in the EU market based on free trade with Canada in durum wheat. The amount that Canada consumes at that price, we see that we take the shipping and the handling costs off of that. We get this price of Canada, and we get alpha epsilon, is that epsilon or eta or something? That's the amount that is exported by Canada, this is consumed by Canada, and this is produced by Canada. Now the EU doesn't like that, so the first thing they do is they put on an ad valorem tax. The ad valorem tax is this line here. All right, notice that it diverges from this excess supply curve. So we get this tax, and then it puts a quota on after the tax so that the line goes straight up. So when we now construct this curve here, what happens is we get that shift upwards slightly, and then we get the supply curve S prime T here. We're barely showing that shift up here, this part, because it's not very clear, so we just have this line here. And when that happens, our new equilibrium is at this higher price, PY1, at point E is where that new supply curve facing or in the EU market intersects the demand for the EU. So now the price in Canada, however, goes down based on the excess supply curve here. All right. What happens then is the price in Canada is P prime C, so we get an increase in the amount that Canadian consumers will consume, but a decrease in the amount that Canadian producers will produce. The exports from Canada fall from alpha theta, or not theta F, I don't know what this is, eta, to alpha gamma. And this triangle, or this rectangle, is the income transfer from producers to consumers, from Canadian producers to consumers. But that little triangle here and this little triangle here are losses. On the other hand, this triangle, this rectangle here, is the gain to European producers, but consumers lose, and we have these two little triangles here that are the deadweight losses from increasing the price. Okay? Not easy to follow. So the tax revenue accruing to the EU is given by the sum of two shaded areas, this one and that one. I'm sorry, I said this was a transfer to consumers, but it isn't, because it's a tax imposed by the Europeans. So both the tax is paid for by both European consumers and Canadian producers. The deadweight losses are the four triangles that I indicated. Much easier from the previous figure to look at it this way. We've got our excess supply function. Here's our quota. So then the quota-induced excess supply function is this one. The demand in the international wheat market is given by ED, excess demand. This is our excess supply from Canada. This area is the area theta, gamma, delta, beta in the previous diagram in Canada. And this is the amount that comes from Canadian producers, the rent. This accrues, or this comes from EU consumers. This is transportation costs, and these two areas, these two rectangles, are the amounts that the European governments make as a result of the quota and the tax. So this is your pure quota rent, these two rectangles. The transportation costs have to come off of that. And finally, if the quota is tighter, then the price difference rises. Whether the tax revenue increases over the previous quota level depends on the elasticities of supply and demand, as do the deadweight losses, the dark areas, but they increase, causing the income transfers. The light shaded areas are your income transfers. So A, B is the income transfer to the EU governments. These dark triangles are the deadweight losses. So you can see, you can look at policies in this way, but you have to be very careful, as it gets pretty complicated and pretty messy. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, I have a book that deals solely with these kind of analyses on a pretty grand scale. Well, I think it is. Thank you.